So we are living indeed in interesting times. But I think what happened to George Floyd is only beginning. And I would like to say at the outset that, this isn't something our county is immune from. Just 3 days after the Fairfax NAACP held a car rally that drew close to, I believe, 2,500 people, about 3 days later, we saw the arrest of one of our own officers who, in a very eerily similar way, put his knee on someone's neck, stun gunned him multiple times. So obviously there are issues there. I've commended, and I'll continue to commend the chief for taking swift action, as well as the Commonwealth attorney for taking swift action for that officer for both violating FCPD policy as well as the law. But I think this opens up a larger conversation about policing here in the county. The FCPD has a over $200 million budget. And while I don't want to misrepresent anything here tonight, incidents aren't frequent here in our county, but when they do happen, use of force incidents, they are almost 50% made up of Black individuals, even though we only make up 10% of the county. So obvious racial disparity there. So that's some of the things that we want to discuss tonight. But I think we also need to talk about the general climate of law enforcement here in the county. While the Sheriff's Department is under separate from the Chief of Police, and I'm gonna make that clear for everyone listening, we saw in March, Deputy McPartland was arrested for sexually assaulting an inmate that he was transporting. This is the same officer who was involved in at least 2 deaths that we know of. So I think with that backdrop, we have to have this discussion, and I promise to be frank and candid, and I want you all to do the same, because I think that is necessary for the reforms we want to see. But the main point of this, why I invited you all to this discussion, is so that the NAACP can put forth its recommendations that are geared at transparency and accountability. I think we all are having a conversation about how to reimagine public safety, and we have that in mind. So we're going to present that both to you all, which I've sent to you in advance, and I'll also present it to our audience watching here on Facebook. I think the main thing to mention here is that we are calling for reform and accountability, and we're hoping that no new dollars are put in to do that. And we can discuss what that looks like, but we believe that a $200 million budget for a police department should be sufficient. And at a time when we ask teachers and others to make sacrifices and educate all our students in the 10th largest school district in the country with budget constraints, we think we need to call on officers to do the same, to make needed changes with the budget that they currently have. So just to recap, $200 million budget dealing with incidents that have happened here in the county, but also dealing with a use of force that is used primarily 50% of the time against African Americans, although we make up 10% of the county. So with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Chairman Jeff McKay. He's here tonight, and then you'll also hear from Chief Ed Rossler. We don't obviously have time to hear from everyone here, but we will have an open discussion where people are encouraged to participate. So with that, I turn it over to Chairman McKay. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here, even though these times are very difficult. And I want to start off by thanking you, not only for putting together the forum, but as you mentioned, the 2,500 person car event here at the Government Center was an amazing sight to see. And I think it really showed where our community is. And then frankly, the unfortunate incident after George Floyd's murder, after that event that happened here in Fairfax County, obviously rocked all of us. I think we all watched with a sense of disbelief in what we saw on the body-worn camera footage. And I applaud all the folks who acted swiftly and quickly, as you acknowledged, to make sure that our Fairfax County values were on the table, and we will not tolerate that type of activity. That being said, I understand everyone's angry and frustrated, and I want to say from the outset that our board not only approved a joint statement that reflected the sense of our entire board, and core to that was, frankly, a belief that Black lives matter, and that, frankly, we've got a lot of work to do as a country, certainly as a state, and as you acknowledged right here in the county. We are not immune from making the types of reforms that are necessary to build the kind of confidence that everyone should have in our law enforcement agencies. And so I think the most important thing for elected officials to do right now is to listen, to hear what our community is saying, to absorb that, let that sink in. We know there's not one policy solution that will solve really, decades and decades of disenfranchisement. And so, we know that whatever policies we put in place are ones that are going to be vetted with the community, but will make our community better. We had a briefing today. Supervisor Lusk is here along with a lot of my colleagues. Had a briefing today in our Public Safety Committee about many of the things that work right, and frankly, an acknowledgement that some things aren't working right, and we've got a lot of improvement to do. I also want to thank you, Sean, for putting together a credible, good list of solid recommendations for us to consider, because I challenge people all the time that, it's easy to be mad. All of us are angry, but we need to channel that into concrete examples of things we can do better. And we owe it to everybody in our community to do better and to be able to pivot forward off of things that happen that make us all disappointed, and do our best to make sure those things don't happen again. And I know that sounds simplistic, but I know the recommendations that you put forward, there was a lot of thought put into those. NAACP and other groups were essential in making a lot of reforms that we've done over the last couple of years. And we consider you to be essential as we move forward, an essential part of the conversation to make us all better. And so I think the main goal I have right now is to listen, to absorb what people are saying, and then to work hand in hand with your organization and others to put in place policies that will help protect us from this type of thing ever happening again. And that's where my heart and my soul is right now. And frankly, look forward to hearing from folks. And I think that should be the number one thing we expect from every elected official. Don't jump to every right conclusion. Don't draw every policy thing you think you can do one policy and check a box and we're done. It's not that simple. We have to listen, absorb, walk together with our community on this, and put in place additional reforms that build on the ones we already have in place to make sure that every citizen of this county feels safe.
Thank you. With that, I'll turn it over to Chief Rossler.
Thank you, Sean. Can you copy me? I just want to make sure. Thanks.
Hear you loud and clear.
I so appreciate the relationship that I have had, not only with you, but all your members over my many decades with the Fairfax County Police Department. And we always talk about the co-production of policing model, which is something that we do well across all agencies in Fairfax County. And that's to take a hard look at ourselves as delivering essential police services to the community. And as the chairman indicated, we have worked well over the years to change policy and create reforms. And blessed to have your list of reforms. Obviously, as a police department with other advocates in the community, we've tackled a lot of these reforms, but we need to do better. Not only here in Fairfax County, but as a law enforcement profession. Some of the policies that are being enacted in an emergency fashion across this country are already in existence in Fairfax County for many years, that we changed our philosophy, obviously, after some awful events in the past. And Sean, you're absolutely right. There are things that are unacceptable that are still happening. And I stand proud to work with our community. I am a community member. I am your chief of police. It is our police department as a community with the board of supervisors and all other advocates. And I so appreciate the list of reforms as a point where we could have good dialogue and create even more change. And I am proud and ready and willing to work with all our advocates. So I look forward to the discussion tonight, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Chief. I wanted to just take a second to recognize the many supervisors who are also on the call: Supervisor Stork, Supervisor Alcorn, Smith, Faust, Lusk, Palchek. I'm trying to make sure I don't miss anyone. Forgive me, I'm on Zoom. Walkinshaw is here. I saw you wave. Hey, James. Did I miss anyone? And I see, oh, Penny Gross, as we speak, is entering the chat. So a new player has entered. And I see Delegate Simon here. Just want to try to acknowledge, and Supervisor Gross, I was just acknowledging everyone, so you came right on time. Thank you. So I want to move forward with our discussion here. If we can we please put up the list of reforms that we're calling for to share our screen? Okay. So the NAACP Fairfax has put forth what we think is a modest list of reforms that we're calling for. And I also want to introduce our chair of the Criminal Justice Committee, Luke Levisar, who's here as well. He helped us, as with the rest of our volunteers, to help put together this list. Some of you have seen this already, but I'll go through it and we'll discuss at the end. But reporting necessary data. Luke, did you want to give them a little bit background on that one?
Well, just that my understanding that with the 2015 reforms that occurred from the Safety Committee, there were agreements and understandings that there would be substantial data released with respect to every use of force incident that occurs in the county. And even though some data has been released, it's not being, we don't believe it's being released consistently and frequently enough. So we would like just an understanding, modification of the understanding that data will be released promptly, consistently, and we'll have all of the different variables that we've discussed here. Police stops, all traffic citations, everything, and it needs to be broken down with respect to the race of the officer and the person, the citizen who is involved in the incident.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. We're calling for this data that really should, I believe, exist and should be out there, but this would give the community some insight into what is happening, not just with use of force, because obviously we're seeing use of force, but Chief, I know you were at the event at Mount Vernon, or in Gum Springs rather, and heard from people how it's not just use of force, that is one element of this, but different policing, frankly, based on race, or at least the perception of it. So we need to understand when people are being stopped, when they're being searched without notice, because this is all part of policing, and it's being done, we think, disproportionately by race, but we need that data to speak to it and address it, frankly. So I'm going to keep going here. Can we scroll down? We've talked about this, and this also goes to the school board, obviously, and we're starting to have those conversations, but removing police from schools. I think this is a really important element. When we talk about the school to prison pipeline, this is where it starts. Officers in schools, in 2018, the GAO, Government Accountability Offices, did a study. Officers in school, the one thing that data consistently shows, it leads to a spike in arrests for Black, Latino, and disabled students, frankly. So what this isn't, and this is more for the people listening on Facebook, this isn't saying that your school wouldn't have access to police in an emergency or that they couldn't enter school grounds. This is to stop officers from working in schools where we see the disproportionality there. We think this is an important step, and not one that we came up out of nowhere with. This is happening across the country, that many jurisdictions are removing the SROs from the schools because it leads to the school to prison pipeline. Moving on to the other thing, we're using our old graphic that didn't correct this, but it should say body worn cameras. We talked about the importance of body worn cameras, and obviously that came into to light with the most recent event that we saw where the officer was caught on camera violating the policy, stun gunning someone and brutalizing them. Here's the thing about the body worn cameras that I think has to go hand in hand. It is a waste of equipment is essentially a lens with a price tag if there is no policy in place that prevents officers from turning this off or prevents them from selectively turning it on. So obviously I understand that needs to be figured out, but we think that body worn cameras is an essential part of transparency here, and it protects everyone. However, with the body worn cameras, we think that this needs to be figured out with the budget and not adding more money to policing. A lot of times what we've seen in the past is when there are problems with police, we give them more money to get more toys. And we think that needs to stop, and I don't think there's an appetite for it here in the county or anywhere else, actually. So I wanted to make that clear, that that's our position on it. Going down to number 4, this is reporting officer misconduct. I view this as a largely necessary step, but one that is gaining traction in bipartisan circles. The president is releasing an executive order calling for a public database on police misconduct that includes both policy violations and law violations. The CBC and the Democrats in the House have put forward a bill that would do the same, creating a database. And this is aimed at stopping police from committing violations in one county and then moving to another. I think this is common sense. You wouldn't hire someone who embezzled in Loudoun County as an accountant here, right? So we can lead in this way, and we've called on this at the state level. I know Delegate Simon's here, and I've had conversations with delegates and state senators that we need this database, but there's no reason we can't lead here from Fairfax County. We have the data, and we can talk about, there's ways to do this in a way that doesn't violate anyone's privacy. But if a police officer has been involved in a crime, misconduct, or anything, the public needs to know about it, and Virginia needs to know about it so that they can't go somewhere else and do the same thing. Number 5 is the review of the use of force policy. The chief is absolutely correct, and we already are doing some of these things that we need to be doing, like banning chokeholds. There is a policy in place similar to the one in Minneapolis that allowed for the firing of the officers, where if you witness someone brutalizing someone or using excessive force, you have to intervene. But that said, every policy can be improved, and I think the mores of our society changes, and we need to be frequently reviewing our use of force policy. I would suggest that we put a review together that has community input within the next 60 days so that we can see and have confidence that we have a use of force policy that all of us in the community feel is appropriate. The 6th item is demilitarizing the police force. This is something that also is happening at the state and national level. But here in Fairfax County, I know a lot of times, I've heard before, we don't use military grade equipment, et cetera. But I think this is something the board can be proactive in putting an actual regulation, or I don't know the best mechanism to do it, whether it be a resolution, but we can go ahead and say we are not going to allow the purchase of military weapons. And of course, I know that law enforcement like to quibble over what is military weapons, but we need to have that be put to community input as well so that we understand what we mean. Tear gas and some of the things that we see on the streets being used against civilians doesn't have any place here in Fairfax County. Strengthen the civilian review panel. So Fairfax County Civilian Review Panel should be independent, investigative, but they should have the power to investigate stuff. Right now, we like to tout that we have a civilian review panel, and it's not lost on me that we got one after the shooting of a white man here in Fairfax, which was, obviously a terrible incident, but I think speaks to the lives that we put value behind. But I think that with the civilian review panel, we can make it actually have some teeth where people respect it. Right now, the civilian review panel essentially reviews whether the police did a proper investigation. They can't put out a set of recommendations for punishment. They can't really do an independent review of their own. And then there's also the question of subpoenas. So we are calling for an actual strong civilian review panel. And I think we should also think about what the makeup of that review panel is. In prior discussions, when this was formed, it was very police heavy, or at least law enforcement heavy and ex-law enforcement heavy. While I understand that law enforcement may want to be there, if it's a civilian review panel, I think it should be exactly that and have some actual civilians on there. And then finally, mandatory counseling and early intervention. This is, again, we try to make all these policy data driven, but must require counseling and appropriate early intervention for officers involved in violent confrontations or other incidents. Importantly with this one, this does not mean excessive force. This does not mean only things that were seen as misconduct. I think any sort of use of force, whether it was appropriate or not, the data shows that if you can intervene in that officer's, with that officer the first time it happens, they have fewer incidents of use of force later on in their career. So we're calling for that because ultimately, I think use of force is what we're trying to avoid if possible. So those were our 8 that we're putting forth there. I'm going to open it up to discussion. And I guess it would make the most sense, Chief Rossler, to see what your reaction is to our recommendations.
Oh, thank you, Sean. I'll just go down the list as far as reporting necessary data. We are gravitating towards a new records management system to achieve this goal, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to enhance that system. Obviously, right now we're being transparent and sharing data. The independent police auditor was tasked by the Board of Supervisors to conduct a study of our use of force data to look at the disproportionality that is there. We cannot argue that it's not disproportional, but we need to have an independent review by an outside agency, which is the University of Texas, under the purview of the independent police auditor, to look at how did these calls come in? Was it by the police, the community members, and look at the reports and go through that. I know we did this years ago, but I welcome that review, and that report by the University of Texas will provide us a great starting point to create more dialogue. But in the meantime, I agree, we need to enhance the transparency of the data, just as you articulated, and we are moving that way.
Chief Rossler?
Yes.
This is Luke Levisor. Just a quick question to follow up. With respect to the data, I understand that the report and the analysis is being done by the University of Texas that you referred to, but why is it that we can't get the data while that report is being analyzed? Why? I thought that the data was supposed to come out consistently, as it's occurring, and we shouldn't need to wait. We don't need to wait. It's great that the analysis is being done, and I'm not criticizing having the analysis done, but we should be able to get the data, sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. Get the data while we're waiting for the report.
I should point out that the analysis isn't scheduled to be finished or completed until January 2021.
Right. And I agree. And we had used the procurement process to get a new records management system. And unfortunately, the vendor that we had could not perform. So we had to basically fire the vendor and get a new vendor. So we're back on track with that. And I'm hopeful because we have a records management system that is a legacy system that cannot perform those functions into the new software environment. So we have to do it by hand. I have a team of staff from my Plan and Research Bureau that are having to pull the data from different sources. So what we're learning from the University of Texas is a different methodology. So hopefully I could slice this data more real time over the next few months until that new records management system is up and running. But it is a big struggle. So, but my goal is to get there. I agree with you. As you mentioned, the school resource officers in the school, we did a new memorandum of understanding almost 2 years ago on this issue, and I appreciate the leadership from all the advocates. And we are working to reduce that concept of school to prison pipeline, because we know that once a young person is injected into the juvenile justice system, they're more than 66% likely to return. So we've stood up over the last couple of years a more robust alternative accountability program. We've worked with the schools to train all the principals and administrators. I went to every one of those training sessions at the school board prior to the school year started, and we are making a headway in that. Clearly, the objective of having officers in a school is to be part of the community and the fabric. And the last thing we want to do is make an arrest. And this is an issue that we need more discussion on. So I look forward to that. Today, at the Public Safety Committee meeting, we talked about the next 2 phases of the body-worn camera program.
May I interrupt, Chief?
Yes.
Could I interrupt you for just a second? This is Penny Gross.
Sure.
I have another Zoom meeting I have to get into, but I wanted to mention on the school resource officers. I'm troubled by this particular recommendation, quite frankly, because in Mason District, we've had school resource officers for quite some time. There was a period of time, and granted it was 20 years ago or more, we had drive-by shootings at the former Jeb Stuart High School. We had a number of serious incidents. We put the school resource officer program into that school, and it has worked very, very well. We have not had the kinds of oh my God things that were happening. At Glasgow Middle School, we had a female officer as the school resource officer who really got to know the students quite well. She noticed one day that one of the girls was not her usual self. And so she took her aside and said, "Is there something going on? You don't seem to be your usual self." And the girl broke down in tears and told the school resource officer that there was a prostitution ring operating on her apartment floor. She was terrified. If the school resource officer had not gotten to know the students that well, that would never have ended up in a situation where the police were able to go in and break up the prostitution ring and make the community safer. These are just a couple of examples of the positives of school resource officers. So I'd be a little careful.
Supervisor Gross, I hope you can give me a chance to respond. I know you have to run to another meeting. And I'm glad you brought this up. I know that of the other recommendations, this gives people some pause. Again, this is data driven in the sense that we see this time again, and we see it right here in Fairfax County, the disproportionate arrests. It's undeniable by the chief, by you, or anyone else on the board, frankly. And while I've heard plenty of anecdotal evidences of, there's a great school resource officer who's a real role model. Counselors can be role models. Counselors can intervene. The story that you're telling me, well, you can roll your eyes about it, but counselors are good and they do stuff in our schools. But counselors can do that. Teachers can do that. What we're saying is, I'm not saying every officer ever put in schools is doing bad. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the introduction of officers in schools, as shown by data, leads to the arrest of Black and Latino students. You can tell me about a drive-by shooting that happened 20 years ago. There are terrible things that happen in our schools with officers present. So what I'm saying is not that we should have, I had a good experience with the police, therefore we set policy that way. We should look at the data and set policy based on data-driven policy and what's going on throughout. I have no doubt that people have had positive interactions with SROs. And I know that people have had negative interactions with SROs. I know that here in Fairfax County, we've seen problems with restraint and seclusion being used in our schools. So I hope you'll keep an open mind to that. I'm not saying that SROs can never have a positive experience. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the data shows that there has been an issue with the arrest of Black and Latino students. And until someone on this board can show me otherwise, I think our position will remain the same, that we will need to remove them from the schools.
Sean, look forward to further information. Thank you.
Sean, if I may, Delegate Watts speaking.
Yes.
If I could share my experience having been on the school safety special commission that met 2 years ago following what happened in Florida. what I saw both in that work and the data that we were given, as well as attending 2 days of the 3-day Department of Criminal Justice Services training, was that I believe that you should expand that recommendation to include training within the schools of school authorities. Beyond, one of our recommendations certainly was to add counselors, but I saw an overuse of the school administration turning to the police to handle situations that should have been handled with good disciplinary procedures within the school itself. And many instances, I'm talking with some of the officers at the Department of Criminal Justice Services training, that they were being overused and put in a compromised situation that should never have been taken place, where they were not following, I'm going to use a broad term, Miranda rights type of procedures because of pressure from the administration. So I'd like to see that recommendation expanded.
Sure. And I take your point, and we have concerns about the overuse of officers, and I think that's what we're getting at here. That in a lot of times, what should be perceived as a behavioral issue, it becomes a criminal issue because you have the presence of a police officer there. I wish that Supervisor Gross was there to hear your answer there, so that we can further this discussion.
Sean?
Sorry. Yes, who's speaking?
This is James Walkinshaw. I know you probably want to move on to the others. I just wanted to add, I mean, to your point about the need to be data-driven, my understanding is that the school board will be receiving a report from the administration on SROs in the school system this summer, I think. So in a matter of weeks or a month, or someone can correct me in the chat if that's wrong, but we will have, I think, or the school board will have data relatively soon to take a look at this issue and make a data-driven decision.
I appreciate that. I would be shocked to see if we don't see the same disproportionality that we've seen for the last few years, because we have data that shows the arrests. But I think we've covered that point and we have our positions on it. But I would encourage the board to really think through this issue. This is an issue that we stopped the addition of SROs to elementary schools, and we had broad support, not only from the disability community, but Moms Demand Action, among others, who stood with us. So this is not a fringe issue in any way. I don't know about school shootings, or drive-by shootings that happened 20 years ago. I'm not sure about that, but I think that we're dealing with our present day community, and we should be open to address it with some of the policy recommendations we see here. Chief, I know you were cut off there. I want to give you the opportunity to continue.
Okay. The next item was body-worn cameras. Obviously, we had 3 phases that were designed after our pilot project, and unfortunately, the economy with COVID-19 has deferred the budget. But under the leadership of Chairman McKay and the board, they took action last week, and we presented today at the Public Safety Committee meeting the structural plan to get back on with those phases. So we have more work to do by the end of this month to report back to the chairman and the board to accomplish that task. I must also remind everyone that for decades we've had an in-car video system. So with the enhancement of body-worn cameras, we're not going to get a whole 360-degree view of everything. However, with the accountability measures of the civilian review panel, independent police auditor, and everybody's right to film the police, we'll get more of a full picture. So obviously there's other work in those accountability areas that you discussed earlier that we need to enhance somehow, way, shape, or form. Number 4, reporting officer misconduct. Obviously, there's many different ways to report your complaints to the police department. That could be through the local district commander, a first line supervisor, our internal affairs website, the chief's email account, any elected official, the civilian review panel, or the independent police auditor. So that I agree we need to educate the community more on those reporting systems and to hold us accountable. And that's what the two independent bodies are doing right now, tracking those complaints. They hold me accountable for getting back to whether it's the independent police auditor or the civilian review panel that's the recipient of a complaint. I have to report back to them. And obviously they provide an annual report on that. More work to come on that. And I appreciate that engagement.
Chief Rossler?
Yes.
If I could, if we could just sort of do one at a time and just, or did you want to run through all of them? I had a question about the body worn cameras because it
Sure.
Went back to something Sean had discussed earlier. If you would, could you explain when it is permissible under the current policy for officers to turn off or turn on them? I'm sure there are privacy considerations. There must be circumstances in which the camera is not turned on, the full 8 hours of somebody's shift or however long a shift is. But, what are the rules? Because what we want to make sure is that anytime there is an encounter with the public, the camera is there. It should be functioning. And within what is possible under the technology. I listened to this part of today's the safety meeting, and I was interested. And I think it'd be helpful if you would explain exactly what the policy is and what's actually happening in the field to the extent that it differs from the policy.
Yeah, good question. So, in a general sense, when an officer is dispatched or comes onto the scene of an event, call for service, if you will, they're to have their camera activated, and then by policy and training, if there's no reasonable suspicion or probable cause that a crime is afoot, they should shut it off. But there's other nuances in here. For instance, if we go for a mental health call for service and we go into someone's house and there's no crime, we need to shut it off for HIPAA protection and to get that person help. There's also times where we are inadvertently into someone's private space. One question that came up today at the Public Safety Committee meeting from a board member was, what about apartment complexes as we're navigating from point A to point B and there's no crime in progress? Obviously, someone that's a victim of domestic violence, we don't want to have their statement or their trauma that's exposed through the Freedom of Information Act. But generally, when there's reasonable suspicion or probable cause that a crime has occurred or is happening, the camera shall be on. And I appreciate the NAACP is one of the advocate groups early on back in the summer of 2014 and several times. And a couple of months ago, before we went live on April 28th with the first phase of the body worn camera program, we developed this policy with all our community stakeholders. Major Chantel Corcoran has been leading that co-production committee. She will schedule a meeting, hopefully either virtual or live in September, because we'll have 4 months of the first phase of the body worn program underway, and we could look back at the data, again, data driven, as to whether or not the policy that we all built together is working or not, and to make enhancements to that policy. Clearly, one of the big items that I learned before we entered into the pilot project, when I observed what were called rigorous pilot projects in Washington, D.C. and Boston, unfortunately, the leaders there did not have a strict discipline policy in place for the pilot project, that you shall abide by this policy during the pilot project. So officers were not turning their cameras on at the appropriate times. So before we rolled out the pilot project, I mandated and verbalized and communicated throughout the agency that this policy shall be abided by during the pilot project. And it worked well. And before we went live, the advocate groups provided significant input to enhance the policy. So this is never ending. So in September, after we get the first quarter in, I invite everyone back to the table with the major to say, hey, is this policy working or not? Here's the data, and let's go over the scenarios. So that shall never end. Again, constant communication and engagement with the community. It's not just one time, it's on an annual basis, but as we do these phases, we need to do it on a quarterly basis to sustain the success of the body worn camera program and accountability.
And Chief, I want to be mindful of the time. You know, I think we've gotten through maybe 3 or 4 of these, but is there anything here you would oppose? I guess that's what we're asking. Where are we starting from? I'm trying to get a sense of our recommendations. Where do we not have alignment? And then I'd also like to make the point that with the data in item 1, that's been promised since 2018, and I understand what Supervisor Walkinshaw said about the SRO data. I've spoken to members of the school board, and they've told me it's taken a long time to get that data as well. So we have a lot of promises for data and more transparency, but we're not actually getting the data. We can't wait till January 2021. Can you give us a time frame of when we'll get the data? So 2 questions. What do you oppose from the list of 8, and when can we expect this data?
As far as what I oppose, I don't think I oppose in whole any one of these items. Obviously, to give more teeth to the civilian review panel and the independent police auditor will require the General Assembly to take action. And if that's the action that is taken by the state, and I'm under oath to abide by it, so that would not be an issue. Clearly, we have to look at the state code for the investigative authority there, because there are other items in place under the law that procedural guarantees for law enforcement officers in the Commonwealth. So that's what we're seeing across the country, where governors are taking action with their general assemblies or equivalent to create change. As far as the data, I am due to give data to the chairman and others on the board, hopefully this week, related to all our use of force through our annual report, and also the school data. I am prepared to give that to the chairman, hopefully by Thursday, and we'll have those 2 sets of data available to create more robust dialogue.
I think Luke can speak to this a little bit, but I think the data we're talking about is a little bit broader than that and was discussed before, but we want it available to the public. I understand that you have to answer to the board, but I think there's a point where we need some more transparency here. And in any case, I'll open this up to the board as well. I have a number of questions here that I would like to direct, but were there anybody here from the board that wanted to comment on the discussion so far?
I could just add one thing, Sean, if that's all right. In terms of reporting of data, and this is more prospective moving forward, and Chief is aware of my thoughts on this, but on July 1, 2020, thanks to efforts in the General Assembly, marijuana will be decriminalized in Fairfax County and across Virginia. I know a lot of us here, myself included, would prefer to have seen outright legalization, but the chief's responsibility now is to implement the new law, which is decriminalization. And one of my priorities is to ensure that we don't see the same disproportionality that we saw with our marijuana arrests, with our marijuana fines of $25. And if we just continue the same disproportionality, we won't have made the progress that we need to make. So I think moving forward, at least for this 1 year, we may only be in this situation of decriminalization for 1 year, but it is important, and the chief knows, I think it's important that we have that data to ensure that we're not perpetuating that disproportionality just with a slightly lesser degree of harm under decriminalization.
Thank you, James. I see Delegate Simon wanted to weigh in on the civilian review panel, I believe.
Yeah, so I want to mention, I give a shout out. I think Delegate Watts and I have both been working on this issue, and I know that she's drafted some legislation in the past to help grant some authority. So I would look forward to getting some guidance from the board on what exactly you're looking for as far as authority. We'll also be working on that, I think, probably on a statewide basis to, if you guys have a lack of legislative authority, that's going to exist everywhere, as well as we're dealing in rural states. So I think we want to empower folks to do that. And Sean, I want to agree with you and just say that I recall the discussion from 2014 and 15 on the Ad hoc Police Practices Commission. And I was certainly one of those voices that said, frankly, to some of the police union folks, what part of civilian are you having trouble understanding, right? I mean, yes, a review panel, they want people that have similar experiences. They don't want to be judged by folks that have never walked in their shoes to some degree. There's a place for that, but that place isn't necessarily the civilian review panel. The civilian review panel is supposed to give a perspective of civilians. So I would also agree with your call for making that more, certainly more dominated by civilian personalities and folks. And again, to the extent that you guys need legislative authority to do the things that the NAACP is asking for board members, please talk to Delegate Watts and I'm sure she agrees that she'd be happy to get some legislation in to give you the authority you want, and also to look at if it's appropriate for doing it in localities across the state. So thank you guys for raising this issue, because I agree with you. I think it needs to be addressed.
I appreciate that, Delegate Simon.
John?
Yes, who's speaking?
I just to Marcus Simon's comments, there's a rich record of the board's conversation about what the civilian review panel was needing, as well as the ad hoc committee's comments about what was needed that wasn't available. We spent a fair amount of time really going back and forth to determine that we didn't have legal authority. The civilian review panel didn't have legal authority to do truly any investigations, which means having conversations, interviewing or kind of speaking with the officers involved or some of the other individuals is purely voluntary. There's no ability to the civilian review panel to really do its own work other than it works through other parties. In this case, mostly the police and their report, and then in terms of the independent auditor also then engages, but none of them in Virginia, my understanding, none of them really have any investigatory opportunities. It's all through the police.
Well, that's certainly something we need to strengthen at the state level. And I hear Delegate Simon saying, tell us what you need. But I think as far as the composition, it is very law enforcement heavy, and it doesn't lead me to feel much faith in that body to be able to review. So I think this is something that we should address and address relatively quickly. The point of a civilian review panel is to give a sense of accountability and trust in the system. But if it's more cops investigating cops, then how is it different than an internal audit or anything else? One of the questions I had that I saw a couple board members, and I guess I'll ask Chief Rossler and Chairman McKay. I've seen people mention in their newsletters recently a task force on equity and opportunity. Who's on that, and is that has that been formed in response to the recent events?
First, Sean, that was an initiative that I brought forward to the board this week. It was partly based on the recommendation that you and others made in response to COVID-19 and disproportionality issues of COVID-19. And so obviously we want to set it up to look broadly at disproportionality, systemic poverty, other issues that we know exist in the county that are some of the underpinnings of some of the many other problems that we're addressing, including the one we're talking about tonight. And so it's not meant to be a panel that necessarily limits itself to public safety issues. In fact, Supervisor Lusk and I had a conversation earlier today about two different strategies. I mean, obviously one where we are documenting all of these recommendations that have come from the community to go through Public Safety Committee and to be vetted with out there on the street in our communities with our neighborhoods in the weeks to come. The Equity Task Force is going to be looking more globally at systemic issues in the county, and frankly thinking about how we can apply metrics to our One Fairfax initiative, how we can take that to the next level. And you're invited to participate on that. We have not set the membership. I asked my colleagues to submit the names of some folks to be considered for the task force. It's important to me that the task force be not just demographically diverse like the county, but frankly, that it's geographically diverse and that it's not disproportional, representation from one part of the county. There are parts of the county that for a long time have felt like they haven't been included in conversations. And I want to make certain that anytime we set up a task force that doesn't continue to occur. So it will be demographically and geographically diverse, and it will meet probably 6 to 8 times. Issue a report. I don't want this to be a committee that has to meet for years and years, because we want good talent on it, people who are dedicated to this cause, to give us recommendations by the end of the year on some of the systemic One Fairfax things that we're working on. Included in that, of course, will be the disproportionality of the pandemic, why that happened, and what systems we can put in place to strengthen to try to prevent that from happening in that disproportional way again. And so that's largely the focus of it, is to take One Fairfax, build on it, apply metrics, make sure we can take that initiative countywide to the next level.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, we would love to serve on that committee, and I think there should also be the committee that, could be the same one, but I think we really do need something soon that focuses on police reform and has real input. I want to be very clear. I speak sometimes too plainly. This shouldn't be death by task force, and it also rolling out communities of trust, which is very closely aligned with the police, is not going to cut it. We need to have actual community support groups like NAACP, NAACP, groups focused specifically on criminal justice reform. Because the other thing I've seen the county do is they include people who are members of the community, who may be pastors or whatever, and they're great members of the community, but I don't know what their qualifications to talk on criminal justice reform is. So I really want to be specific here that you will have an illegitimate committee if it doesn't have the right people on it, and we will call that out from the beginning.
Well, and actually, Sean, to that point, that's why we want to make sure that the criminal justice issues that we're talking about don't get swept into a larger conversation about all of the other things at a countywide systematic level that we have to address. And so this is not meant to capture the issues necessarily directly we're talking about here tonight, because I think those things do need to be on a separate track. And I agree with you. It can't be, believe me, we don't have the capacity for death by committee either. This has to be a group that, can be stood up, can make clear recommendations to us that involve, all demographics of the county, to your point earlier. And you'll be on it. I'll be happy to work with you on the roster. But what I have asked my colleagues to do is submit names of people within their district that they think can speak well on a lot of these equity issues that the county has been challenged with, so that we can do better. And those recommendations are coming in to me. Once we have those, we will be setting up the committee. And we hope that the committee really represents the county. And it's my objective to do that.
I appreciate that. And since we're on the topic of law enforcement broadly, I'll open this to you and also Supervisor Walkinshaw. You all were kind enough to appear with us on our virtual general membership meetings. And one of the questions I had for both of you at the time has been a deep concern for me is, what do you see as the Board of Supervisors' role in oversight of the Sheriff's Office? Chairman McKay, I know you said that this is an elected official, you have a big county to manage. I have a real issue with that, and I'll tell you why. Because we are funding the Sheriff's Department, and for those who may be listening on the line, as of March, we had a Deputy McPartland, is in the news, and was kind of covered up by the news because of COVID, who sexually assaulted an inmate in March. The same deputy killed 2 people, including Natasha McKenna, who he stun gunned to death. How does this happen? How does the same deputy have 3 different incidents, 2 of them resulting in death, and we simply say that the sheriff's elected? I think that we need to go after the funding of the sheriff. And I want to know, if not the funding, what are you, and this can be open to any supervisor who wants to answer, what are you and the other supervisors willing to do to put a check on a sheriff's department that seems to have a history of violent incidents?
Well, let me start, Sean, because I do think that this is one that, frankly, is going to be most helped by our state representatives, because I do think that, the state, this is a constitutional officer, separately elected, as you know, a state-funded organization as well. A lot of the resources that we give to the sheriff's office are to help a lot of board initiatives as well. And so if I just go cut the budget, then, there are code requirements of services that the sheriff must provide. And if we start cutting out the county discretionary funding that we give to the sheriff, we might be cutting out a lot of important programs to our community. And so, I don't have the direct numbers in front of me, but I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that the sheriff in Fairfax County does a lot of discretionary things that sheriff's offices across the Commonwealth of Virginia don't do, whether it's detox programs that they bring into the jail, participation in diversion first. There are a number of things the sheriff does that they're not statutorily required by the state to do. And so if we go cut the budget, what I'm afraid of is, of course, the first things then that get cut are the very things that are elements of the sheriff's office that we might most support. So I think we have to look at that before we just, conclude, go after the sheriff's budget, is what does that really do in terms of the sheriff's operation and what the state requires them to do. I think the other piece of this is one of your recommendations about officer misconduct should apply to the sheriff's office as well. And if we put that in place for the police department, I don't know what the state regulations are with what can be done with the sheriff's office, but if there is state statutory requirements that are necessary to be met for that to happen, I would hope that we would hold the same standard for our sheriff's deputies that we hold for our police officers. And that if anything we put in place to hold accountability for those officers, then the sheriff should be putting in place those same accountability measures, even if they need state enacting authority to be able to achieve.
I hear you on some of the things you're saying, and I'm going to give an opportunity for other supervisors to answer. One of the things that I think COVID has exposed is we were able to reduce the county jails by something like 30%, right? So I didn't see rampant crime throughout Fairfax once we did that. So it suggests to me that we were imprisoning people we didn't need to imprison. So I think there needs to be a reexamination of that budget generally, because you don't need to be imprisoning people the way you did if you were able to release them in a moment.
I certainly agree with that part. And it was actually up closer to 50%. And if there's a silver lining in this COVID, it was that. So I think we got to take a real look at that, what happened and why.
Well, I guess I don't want to let you off the hook, and I want to let other supervisors answer. I want a commitment that you're going to examine the budget, because if you don't agree with what's happening there and you have any sort of budgetary responsibility, to simply say that it's out of your hands, I think is unacceptable. We saw that you can reduce this population by 50%. We see the ongoing incidents. Why aren't the supervisors responding to this?
So Sean, I just want to be clear. I didn't say that we wouldn't look at it. I think we do have to look at it. All I'm saying is that when you look at making just budget cuts, we don't have the authority to make line item budget cuts in the sheriff's office, just like we don't with the school system. So all I'm saying is that when we look at this in totality, we have to be cognizant of what does the state require the sheriff to do in terms of performance and what is discretionary, and understand that if we cut county funding, the first things that will get cut are the discretionary things, because she is required by Virginia law to provide certain services. And so I'm not saying not look at it. I'm not saying we don't have that authority. I'm just saying we have to look at it, the full spectrum, and understand that just a cut without context might end up hurting us in ways that we hadn't anticipated. That's all I'm saying. And that's a part of the equation that we have to look at.
Okay.
Sean, may I also, there's very strong interest in the General Assembly on the Crime Commission and the Courts Committee, now under the leadership of Charnel Herring, on this issue. So this all needs to also move forward on that track, as far as overuse of incarceration and not using various diversion points, as far as a number of things that have been on the state books. We started making change this session, but I can assure you that this is high on the priority for continued action in the next session. So you need to definitely be linking up. And the other thing, when you mentioned Natasha McKenna, again, under the change of majority party representation on the Deeds Commission, which is definitely in this next year. Hopefully we'll be able to meet with the same robust schedule. There's a lot of undone work that has to do with diversion and crisis intervention training, all of which brings the right allies together, because not only Black and Hispanic populations, but especially Black populations, but disabled populations are equally apt to be the victim of brutality and other issues when they're in a confined setting.
Sean, if I may, yeah.
Thank you for the answer, Delegate Watson. I'll turn to Supervisor Palchak.
Oh, thank you. No, I appreciate it. I really, I think we're almost 6 months into my new role and learning quite a bit. Just going back to what Chairman McKay said, I think my initial gut reaction coming from the school board is, right, I don't want our board to cut the school board budget because we're unhappy with decisions they're making. So, right, the state has set us up in this little bit of a conflicting dynamic between our budgets and our constitutional roles. And so I think that, I don't know how many states do it this way, but it does provide a little bit of, some challenges. As you know, as I sat there with you and NAACP and others, as we were reviewing over a couple of years at the SROs, I think there are a couple of things that we've shown, and that I think the data continue to show us that we need more data. I think today I found out on the audit committee that we still do parking tickets by hand. I was shocked to hear that. So I absolutely think we need to make sure, I think at least 3 of your points relate to data. And I think we have a lot of data out there in the county and the schools and probably in the sheriff's department, and really being able to analyze that, being able to make decisions based on that. I can form a good relationship with an SRO or a school principal or someone else in our department, but that does not tell me what the data will tell me about either disproportionality or other areas that we need to address. So I think we need to get better at that and reporting that data so that we can make those decisions. I also think that we need to work together both with our colleagues and other boards or the sheriff, but also hold each other accountable. And where there are, legislative issues like have been brought up, we have to, work with you and work together to help address them. I think one thing that I'm hearing that, I would agree on is we've made some big changes, as you know, with body worn cameras, with the SRO. I think we're about to get data. I know we're anxiously waiting to see what that looks like. I know it took a long time on the school board just to get our equity report published. And I think we're all a little bit anxious to see those come forward more quickly. And then finally, and I think why the data is so important is because we're really talking about trust, right? And the number one way to build that trust is to be able to have that transparency, to be transparent about the data, what's working, what's not, to repair areas that we see are not working, and they're not easy. And I know even working with the chief, it's not easy to make those changes, even if we change them in policy. And then to be able to show that that change is there, right? That we've made those changes, we rebuilt that trust. And I think then, those relationships maybe get us a little bit farther than data when you get to that point. So, just a little bit maybe naive on my point and thinking that we can get there. And I know there are areas where we're not there yet, but I'm committed to looking at it. I don't see personally anything blatantly sticking out in your, I'm trying to pull up 2 things at once, in your policy statement that sticks out at me and says, no, we cannot do that, right? Yeah. How we get there and what are the appropriate steps to really reduce, some of those instances that we have there every day as we create new models. And then the last thing I want to say is, I know we talked a little bit about the diversion program. You may or may not know that the courthouse is physically, not just within the county, within my district. And I know that we are looking at redoing the massive complex, which I think now is just called the courthouse complex. And that does include additional programming for diversion first. I was a little bit concerned. I think initially that was not looked at as the first phase of that project. And I encourage you and everyone involved to really follow the development of the planning around the courthouse, because I think how we plan that, how we plan affordable housing, diversion first comprehensive programming is also happening in our land use policy. And that's one of those. So it really is across all of our agencies.
I hear you. And Supervisor Palachuk, I want to say, we've worked together when you were on the school board, and it's great to have a lot of data, but if it's not readily accessible or publicly available, and that's why we, at the school board level, had to create the dashboard where it's a little bit better. Here, these data promises, as far as item 1 of our list, as far as I know, this has been discussed since 2018, right? So we're at the point where, when are we getting the data? And if school board members are also saying that the data is slow, I think this is something the board needs to examine, because here's the thing, we're talking about all this data, but the data we do have shows racial disproportionate use of force. So I guess I would open that up to, is there a real movement here? I understand you've got a new vendor and, dog ate the homework and that sort of thing. When are we getting this data? And also I would add, what are we doing about the disproportionate use of force in the meantime? I know we're waiting for a study in January 2021, but we are sitting, I can't help but to, think about, we're sitting 13 miles away from the Capitol on fire because of one bad incident. So if we have the one bad incident here, are we just going to say, well, we're still waiting for the data in January 2021? So I just want to have a better understanding. What are we doing with the data we do have, and when can we expect this data? Additionally,
our annual report is due to come out in a few days. I actually got a draft of the annual report this afternoon, so I have to go through a validation process with staff tomorrow, and hopefully that is ready. I would offer that, and I know your predecessor, I offered this, but we didn't get this off the floor, but I would like to have a committee with your organization and a few other organizations to sit down and look at our data, look at redacted police reports, and look at the current data and start looking with your eyes and others. What are you seeing, and what do we see, and have that dialogue. Look at our training at the academy, our in-service training, and peel back the layers of that and have that discussion, because that's what we've done with the ad hoc commission, and I'm willing to have that discussion so we can follow up afterwards, and we could do that.
Yeah, I'm happy to join a committee of equals, as long as there's no organization that's a chair that can shut down discussion, or as long as it's actual committee of equal community leaders, that's fine.
Great.
The other thing that I would say is, again, we're talking about data, but we know the reality of it. We see the racial disproportionate with all the disproportionality with all the data that we see. What is being done? I really don't hear anything other than we need some change at the state level. We need some change here and different things. What can we do locally now or within the near future to address this issue if people are feeling that the Black community is being policed differently?
Again, I think we start with looking at the data and what are other diversion techniques that we should be doing. First, we need to understand if there's a problem. Obviously, the University of Texas is tasked with that, and I'm also wondering when they give us the data back, are there social issues that we need to address that the police need to connect to other services and not actually be the tip of the spear, but are we missing something at our young community member level in that engagement, whether it's police or other agencies, and that's what I'm hopeful for. So right now we are heavily engaging with everybody to build trust and respect with the awful things that are happening in our country, but we need to work together better and harder. And that's my pledge to you, because some of these issues are not just police issues. When you talked about the school issues, we enhanced the memorandum of understanding to create a better firewall between administrative duties and criminal issues, and try not to criminalize every single thing that happens in a school. And I think we need to start with that lens on the other issues. What are the trends of the crimes in the data, and how could we work to prevent those from becoming injects into the justice system. And I think that's a goal of putting together a committee.
And Chief Ross, I appreciate your answer because I know you honestly believe that, but I think the issues are systemic and require policy change. So the supervisors, I would really love to hear what some of your thoughts are on some of this. And we can try to build community. We have events with the police, we have this thing, but there's a systemic issue here. And I would love to see how we are addressing the systemic issue, not how the state needs to do it, not how, you know, just the chief needs to do it, but what we're doing at the board of supervisor level. Anyway, that's Supervisor Walkinshaw, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'll just throw out an issue that, you know, I think, and I said it already, so I apologize, but I think is timely and have to address urgently is how we handle marijuana decriminalization. And the chief has the numbers, but a huge percentage of our arrests are for marijuana possession, and they are more disproportional than all of our other arrests. And ensuring that in this 1 year time period, that disproportionality does not continue during the decriminalization phase that we're in Virginia, I think is urgent and can have a tangible impact and improvement for communities of color in Fairfax County. It doesn't solve every problem, but I think it's something we can focus on now and significantly improve where we are in FY21 starting July 1 versus FY20.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to weigh in?
Sean, it's Supervisor Alcorn.
Yes, Supervisor Alcorn, go ahead.
Thanks. You know, I wasn't around for all the reform stuff over the last few years, but, you know, I would, today during the public safety meeting, I asked for some data on basically what are police officers being used for? You know, what kind of calls are they getting? What's the community need? I would actually like to have that discussion because I'm not sure, you know, sending out folks with firearms is the best approach in 2020. I think we may actually have, you know, right now we got two choices. You know, when you call 911 when there's something going on, it's police or fire and rescue. And frankly, I'm not sure that's really addressing the community needs. I'm not sure it's sending the right signal in a lot of situations, and frankly, ends up perhaps even creating bad situations that none of us want. So I would actually be in favor of having that conversation and seeing if there's something else that we might look to do, you know, to meet the community needs, and you know, without doing it the way that, you know, we've been doing it for decades.
I appreciate that comment, Supervisor Alcorn. Oh, go ahead, Supervisor Lusk. Oh,
Yeah.
so Faust and then
Faust,
Lusk.
yeah.
Sorry, sir.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate what Supervisor Alcorn just said. And I think it is a conversation we have to have. When we did all the reform that we worked on for a couple of years, areas that were really highlighted at the time included recruitment and, you know, getting more of a force that looked like our community, and training. Just, you know, I mean, everybody seemed to think at the time that, you know, training and implicit bias and the types of issues that, you know, may not come natural, but definitely need to be learned if they don't. And I think you asked what we think we can do. I think we can do a lot of things, but I definitely think we cannot forget about those issues. You might even say soft issues that we identified previously. I would like to see us pursue them more aggressively.
Supervisor Lusk.
Yeah, with the Public Safety Committee meeting today, we had this conversation about kind of the path forward. And I'll be clear in saying that we recognize that there's some things that we've done well here in Fairfax County. We can be certainly appreciative of the decisions that we've made with, our police department. That we have, I would say, some policies in place, use of force, de-escalation, and others that when they are, adhered to, we have a situation that is good. But then when they aren't, when we aren't having our officers, for whatever reason, doing the things they've been trained to do, including, looking to use their, diversion first training, and also their CIT training, we see the consequences of that. And I would argue that we can do a lot as it relates to, communication within the police force, and really establishing what I would say is a stronger bridge. Because today we have somewhat of a break between our community and our law enforcement as it relates to trust in some of our communities. And that's not going to be easily fixed. I think we've got to, do some of the hard work around communicating and sharing and really talking around some difficult issues. And I personally appreciate Chief Rossler for what he has done in the Officer Timberlake case. I know that it's not been easy for him, and I know that there's been some backlash as well. And I would state that tells us something, right? I mean, there are going to be some folks who will look at that incident and see very clearly that there's a problem and this should not have happened. And you can cite verse and reason why not. And you might have others who look at the exact same incident and they have a different conclusion. And those two parties, in some cases, are working in the same department. So how do we, address, I think, that too, in terms of understanding the sensitivities and understanding the angst and the pain and the frustration that so many in this community feel as a result of seeing that, and helping maybe some of those officers who might look at that and say, we think everything was done properly in that case. So we've got to do some work here with the police department. With the board's got to be engaged in these conversations. I've personally committed myself to go out and talk to different groups and to try to have this kind of conversation as well and understand what are recommendations, and then to have those recommendations put into what we're right now calling a matrix, which is a list of recommendations, including the ones that you've identified here, Sean, as well as, NOVA, EAC, ALU, ACLU, People Power, ACLU, People Power, and others to define a path that we can take with the community, and then have those recommendations come back to the Public Safety Committee, and then have those advanced to the board. So we intend to have an answer or a resolution on each of those items. And this is part of the transparency. This is a part of the process that we're going to have to undertake in order to, reconnect and rebuild trust with the broader community. And that's also with law enforcement as well as our minority communities on both sides.
Appreciate that. Just to respond, I know we had a couple comments back to back. To Supervisor Alcorn's report. Honestly, I wish Supervisor Gross had stayed. She would have benefited the most from this conversation. We are putting too much responsibility on police, and it's not to say that, like I said, there may be good SROs out there. There may be good officers. I'm sure there are. It's that we are responding to everything as if only a person with a gun can handle this. So, and that's exactly the point I'm making with the SROs in schools. She gave this lovely story that she seemed to, roll her eyes when I responded to, but a counselor could have been there and been that person to intervene. You did not need an officer with a gun to do that. And so I when we say take the SROs out of schools, that's really what we're talking about here, is not everything needs to be solved. Everything's not a nail, and we don't need a bunch of men with hammers, because eventually they will use the tools they have. So I really hope that I take your point, Supervisor Alcorn, and then I saw that Supervisor Faust was talking about training and diversity, and I'm glad he mentioned that as well, because we, a few years ago, a lot of people were talking about that. One, I don't think we've made all the much inroads as far as diversity, but throughout the nation, we are seeing that the training is not leading to better results either. So if we get on this call and we walk away, and I know we have delegates here and probably state senators listening as well, if we walk away in August from emergency session with officers take more training, we have failed. We know that doesn't work. So I think that we need to think of stuff outside of that. And I think SROs out of schools gets directly at the heart of that we're putting too much on men with gun cops who are trained to do one sort of thing. And giving them more training to do more jobs is not the answer to that. So I want to make that clear. And I appreciate your point, Supervisor Lusk. This is a discussion that's going to have to happen in the community. But one of the things I'm worried about, and I'll be completely frank, and I know others on the line may be worried about this too, there is urgency here. There is urgency here that I'm not sure people are recognizing, but it needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed properly. There's going to be no political fix to this. It needs to be addressed. It also needs to be addressed quickly. We shouldn't have to wait 2 years for data, right? We shouldn't, and we're talking about data. We have the data already showing that there is a problem that needs to be addressed in ways that we haven't thought of before. So we are at a moment, I think, in time where we have this opportunity where people across the nation are open to making these sorts of changes. And I'm looking towards y'all to do these things. So I wanted to say that, but did Luke or anyone else have a question before we start to wrap this up? Or did anyone else want to interject?
I don't have a question. I just wanted to say, to sort of follow on, we're in a place where we have a series of sort of right-wing progressive supervisors and legislators here in Northern Virginia who wanted to move in the right direction. I think Sean's point is right and well taken. We just need to move faster and more aggressively, because we've seen these problems for quite a while. And we've taken steps, we've implemented training, we've done a series of things, but the problems still are out there. They're still existing and could happen tomorrow, hopefully not, but we just need to move as aggressively as we can. Chief Rossler, you offered to have us be a part of the committee. Rest assured, we'll do anything that we're asked to within sort of the requirements that Sean laid out, but we're eager to do anything we can to help move this process forward. So let's just move as fast as we can, because steps have to be taken quickly as possible.
I saw Supervisor Stork's hand. I just want to recognize you.
Thank you, Sean, and Luke, thank you for your comments as well. And I just want to reiterate a couple of ones that have been made about the role of the police officer has grown so large in so many different directions over the particularly last 10 or 20 years. It's not like what's happened in other public positions. You think of a teacher, particularly I was on the school board for 12 years, and what is expected of them now versus 20 or 30 years ago. And so I think Supervisor Alcorn's point, and I think others of us have seen some of the thoughts, some of the thinking that's going around about other ways we can approach how we do some of what we do. I think those are absolutely valuable things that the board can and should take a look at, and I can assure you that I'm going to take a look at it. The other part of this, which I deeply believe as well, is there has to be more intensive, localized community engagement. In Mount Vernon District, Gum Springs, and many of our other, Sacramento, and many of our other more disadvantaged communities, and whether Latino or African American, without a police officer who's connected and engaged and involved, you're not going to have them feel be part of that community and if you will, feel the pulse of that particular community. And without that, I think there's always going to be an outsider feel to that. And that's not what I think is the essence of good policing. And I think that the chief would probably be the first to agree with that because of all the things that we've done to try to at least assure the immigrant community why we are not here to enforce federal law. And so I'm going to keep pushing on that because I think we've not really gone after that in the way we could and should. And you add that to other opportunities to have more specialized responses to more specialized situations, whether it's mental health or otherwise, or family disturbances, et cetera. I think those are huge opportunities for us to approach some of what we do differently and take, if you will, the guns out of the situation and as a first line of defense, offer other steps that are far less, threatening to somebody who may be involved with it.
I'm muted. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to wrap this up. I want to thank you all for participating today. We covered a lot, and I, as you know, this is the first discussion, I'm sure, of many, and I hope continued discussion, but hopefully we move quickly on enacting some of these reforms. Just to recap, we are open to being on a committee, and Chairman McKay, I would definitely take you up on suggesting members of our community should be on a committee, as you offered earlier. Would love to do that, and I think there are people with serious backgrounds in criminal justice reform that we should have at the table. I challenge the board, help us to get this data here first. We are a very wealthy county. We're a top-notch county. We're one of the leading counties in the nation. There's no reason that we can't have a website with transparent data that you apparently have. There's no reason we have to wait to January 2021. I understand that's for the analysis, but the police are like any other government function. We need transparency and accountability. And so if we've been waiting for this data since 2018, I would think that the board should be more upset with that than us that this isn't made public, right? So the other thing, we have our agenda. I'm very transparent. We're going to be pushing it, and we're going to activate as many members of the community to push it as well, so that you all remember. We do want SROs out of school. I don't want to be misunderstood here. We're not calling for training. We're not calling for just one guy. Like, we want them out. And we think that's a necessary step. And we believe in that as much as we believe in the other steps here. I will work with, I see Delegate Simon, I'll come to you in a second. I will work with our state delegation, our state senators to get legislation that empowers you, but I encourage you all to work with them as well. Delegate Simon's offering that, obviously. But if you don't have the power, we need to empower you. But there are changes that can happen now, and we need to stop pointing to other people. We need to get it done. One of the things with the civilian review board we all talked about is the composition of it. It doesn't inspire trust. So if you're not looking for a rubber stamp and you're looking for actual civilian review panel, I think that that's something we need to take into consideration. With that said, I also want to state the NAACP's position. We're not calling for an increase in the police budget to get any of this reform done. It's just like how the teachers figure out how to manage when everyone cuts their budgets. I think the police can figure out the same thing. And so I want to be very clear in that. And yeah, I think we've said our piece, and we will continue to do that. And before I wrap up, I'll recognize Delegate Simon.
No, that's okay. I didn't mean to step on your closing argument. I just, I had my hand up from before, but I'll leave the last word with you. I'll get back with you offline. I think you're absolutely right. I think we have an opportunity right now. We got to seize it and act boldly and aggressively, and we can make things happen. So
yeah,
thank you for doing the
phone. Yeah, and I appreciate you attending, and I'm welcome working with you or anyone else. I'm not shy about that, so I will reach out, and if there's anything we can do, we'd be more than happy to help. With that, I don't have anything else. Anyone else wanted to say any closing remarks?
Sean, can I just make a really, really quick ask?
Sure.
And I've enjoyed working with you. I know you don't live in Providence District. And as I'm looking to have some conversations and work here, would appreciate if you if NAACP could either, send us folks who are in our districts that we can work with, those of us who are magisterial district members, and maybe folks who want to get more involved in all of our committees, including the ones we send to the chairman of the task force.
Okay, absolutely, we can do that.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all. You'll be hearing from me. I don't know if you want to, but you will. I'll talk to you again soon. Take care.